Harvey, I appreciate you joining me. How did you first find out about ultrasound?
All right, I was working in the cardiac catheterization laboratory. I was actually studying left ventricular function in patients with mitral stenosis. And we were using usual pressure and cardiac output and,
sure.
and tried to get a volume pressure relationship. It was tedious and not to my satisfaction. I saw an advertisement in a throwaway piece of paper of some sort saying that they could measure instantaneous cardiac volumes with ultrasound.
Right.
I called them up. It was a company called Biosonar. And I asked, this is intriguing, how does this work? He said, well, we're showing this instrument at the American Heart Association meeting. At that time it was in Los Angeles.
And what year are we talking?
This was 1963.
1963,
right.
Okay.
And I was going there because I had previously been in electrophysiology and I was presenting a paper left over from my electrophysiology days anyway, so I'm going to be there. I said, all right, I'll come there. So I went to the booth, and there was a single person, one instrument. And I said, well, tell me, how do you do cardiac volumes? She says, cardiac volume, what's cardiac volumes? I said, no, wait a minute. And I talked to, I don't have any idea. I said, why are you here? Why is this machine here in a cardiology meeting? He says, I really don't know. I said, well, and I thought it was ridiculous. So, what does this thing do? And they told me a little bit about it. And basically, the machine was for the Mmode machine for midline of the brain.
Midline, yeah.
Okay. And so I'll tell you what, let me have that transducer. Let me just see something. So I took a transducer, and then I bared a portion on my chest and put it on my chest, and I saw a spike. An Mmode signal, and it was moving.
Moving spike. Okay.
And I said, wow, that's intriguing. My God, and then of course I would check with my pulse, and that had to be from the back wall of my heart. I assumed was the back wall of the left ventricle. And I said, well, hey, tell me again, how does it, what am I seeing here? And they told me a little bit about acoustic impedance and why a signal might show up and all that. And the first thing that came to my mind, I said, well, what happens if you had fluid back there? So, well, fluid should give you any signal. He says, can you pick up pericardial fluid? Well, what is pericardial? He didn't know what pericardial fluid was.
Pericardial fluid? Yeah.
So I was there with, it's an interesting story here. My colleague was on the paper with me when we were both fellows. His fellow named John Bowers. And I got John, I said, John, come over here. I think you can pick up pericardial fluid with this technique. He started laughing. He just thought that was the biggest joke. But anyway, I was intrigued.
Right.
All right, I asked them, could you bring an instrument to Indiana and let me play around with it?
Right.
And they said yes. Well, that's the last time I ever heard of them. They went bankrupt. I never saw them again in my life. So I came back to Indiana and I mentioned this to someone. I said, I was intrigued. I saw this instrument. It's an ultrasound instrument, and I bet you could pick up pericardial fluid with this darn thing. And somebody said, well, neurologists have a machine they're using for midline. Sure. So I went over there and I found it, and it was just gathering dust. They weren't using it very much, or at least I hope not. And I borrowed it. I think I asked permission, I'm not sure. But I borrowed the machine, and I went in, and by God, I could find that spike on everybody. And I was just going around randomly. So I put out a call, I want a patient with pericardial effusion. And somebody showed up and said, yeah, I've got a patient with pericardial effusion. I went there, and by God, there's two spikes. One that's moving and the other isn't. Well, I was obviously excited. And so I contacted a fellow named John Waldhausen, who was a cardiac surgeon, who had an animal laboratory, dog lab. I had no laboratory. I told him the story. I said, come on, we got to go to the dog lab. We got to create this pericardial effusion, and let's see if we can duplicate it. And we went there, and we did. He injected some saline into the pericardium, and that one signal became two, and as we put in more, they got farther apart. And then as we took the fluid away, came closer together. Did it in 5 dogs, worked every time exactly the same way. We wrote it up, and it appeared in March, JAMA 1965. That started the whole thing.
That's incredible.
Now, actually, I'm going to show a picture of that machine tomorrow, because we're talking about loners and stuff like that. And it all started. And then once I knew that, in fact, I predicted Smith-Kline instrument was the instrument that I got.
Sure.
That was what it was. And it turned out to be a fluke. I would never have gotten that with any other instrument.
Really?
In fact, I'm going to show that slide of that picture tomorrow. and say, this is the instrument that started echocardiography. Not the Siemens thing that you see. It's this one. And why do I say that?
Yeah.
Because the detection of pericardial effusion was, in fact, the first clinically long-standing technique that had some relevance. The EDF slope that Edler was using never were panned out. In fact, there was a lot of false positives and some sad stories associated with that.
Right.
And the reason it worked was that for some reason, SmithKline decided to differentiate the echo signal. It was a very thin signal.
Sure.
No one else did that. And how did I find that out? Because the only other person in the United States who was working was Claude Joyner. He was using a Sperry instrument, thick echoes. Even later, when Ray Gramiak got into it, he was using a Picker instrument, thick echoes. In fact, we wrote up the first article in JAMA in March of 1965.
Right.
We followed it up with the Annals of Internal Medicine article, then an AJC article, and then in Circulation.
All in pericardial effusion?
All in pericardial effusion.
Okay.
All in pericardial effusion. The one in Circulation was the swinging heart for electrical alternance.
Sure.
And the others were with the Mmode. The first one was an A mode. We then got a slow sweep, which was the Mmode module. And that's where we published in the Annals, and then a further extension of that work in AJC. All right, and that's already, by 1970 now is already there. In 1971, Ray Gramiak published in the North American Clinics on Radiology.
Right.
There was a series of books there. And he says in 1971, ultrasound is of no value in pericardial effusion. Why? Because he had this Picker instrument, thick echoes, and there were each echo was about a centimeter thick. So unless you had something more than a centimeter apart, you couldn't tell that there were two signals. They all blended into each other. So it was fortuitous that I happened to find an instrument that had the right machine.
When Harvey, if you took, so you moved from A mode,
yeah,
and then tell me about, so we go next to M mode.
Yes, that was fairly brief. It was obvious to me. Then once I did this, then I obviously searched the literature to find out,
right.
And that's when I found out that there was somebody called Edler. So I went to get his, and Joyner actually had published in the same year,
right.
In 1960. So I knew Mmode existed, I just didn't have it. So unfortunately, my chief of cardiology didn't like what I was doing. He thought it was a total waste of time. Refused to give us any financial support. So what I had to do is beg, borrow, and steal whatever I could get from equipment. So I called SmithKline,
right.
And they had a module. In fact, you can always tell which is the original instrument that I used, the first one. Because if you look at the instrument, there's one module that's gray, everything else is kind of white. Because that gray was a borrowed module from, or a loaner if you want, from SmithKline. And I went to Philadelphia to get that, and I really had to, they were about ready to give up on it because
right.
they weren't making any money with
right.
it. And then that's when I also visited Joyner to see what he was doing, and he was just doing the EDF slope, which didn't take me much time at all. Once I got an Mmode module and started doing EDF slope, I found out I could do that on a lot of people. So that wasn't going to fly with that. And so shortly, I would say within 6 months or longer or less, I got the slow sweep module which converted to M mode rather than A mode, right. And that's where the annals
So
article.
what year are we talking now?
Oh, 65, 66, or
okay.
No, actually, yeah. I think we published in 66, very shortly, 6 months after the first article came out, because I already had the module before it was published.
Once you get this, then what are you doing with this? What's happening now? What are you thinking about doing next?
Ventricular function. I was always interested in ventricular function. Here's an interesting story. Once we had M mode, and then of course I worked as much over the years trying to get how we record as to what we record.
Right,
I always have. And so we were doing Polaroid for a long time, but that was literally a pain in the neck. You had to stick your neck in there. So I knew we needed a strip chart recorder. In fact, that's the only real contribution that Hertz made in the field. It's Edler and Hertz, Helmut Hertz.
Sure.
He developed a strip chart recorder using inkjet technology for INGI. In fact, that's really Hertz's major contribution is inkjet technology. He held many of the patents, and
Really?
so all we know now is all directly related to Edler's work, with Hertz's work with inkjet technology. But it was obvious we needed a strip chart recorder, so I worked a lot with that. I worked first with Electronics for Medicine, which was the major strip chart recorder. They said they're not going to waste their time on ultrasound. It had no future, and they wouldn't give us any support at all. So what I did there from that was I got wind of the fact somebody said that Honeywell makes a small strip chart recorder. It's made for the U-2 spy plane. It can record. It's very fascinating. It uses ultraviolet to develop the paper, and they can see things from 50,000 feet. So it was being displayed in Indianapolis at some industrial park. I went there, and the fellow who was showing it was actually an engineer from Cincinnati. And I said, we need something that can give a strip chart recording of our ultrasound. Well, he didn't know anything about it, but he was intrigued enough, and I talked him into bringing it in. So he brought a machine into our laboratory, and we went through it. And the first one, actually, he blew a fuse, and when it talk about fire, we had a fire. It really set off the alarm. But eventually it did work.
Yeah.
And that was the first commercially viable strip chart recorder for the Mmode echocardiography. But in the meantime, there was a lot of, my major interest was always for looking at left ventricular function. That's why I got into it to begin with. Well, when we found out about the mitral valve, and it's obviously not specific for mitral stenosis at all. Right. And at that time, I had an Egyptian doctor working with me, Adab Zaki. He was a very bright young, well, he was older than I was actually. He wasn't that young. He'd been around and he'd trained in England. And in any case, and so we tried to figure out why is that E to F slope so nonspecific, because we're finding that a lot of people, especially if they had some left ventricular function, we anticipated that it must be because of the annulus. It might be through the mitral, we called it the mitral ring at that time, right. Had to influence it. So we searched all over to find out if we could record the mitral ring to explain this E to F slope. Well, we found out that if you put the transducer at the apex, that you can get the annulus, and it's a separate picture from what the mitral valve looked like. And so his take on it was it explained because the diastolic slope of the annulus paralleled the diastolic slope of the mitral valve. Well, that's what he thought was interesting. What I looked at it, I said, it looks like a left ventricular volume curve.
Interesting.
And I saw people who were sick who had an amplitude which was less than people who were well.
Yeah.
And so we went ahead and did a study, and it was published in Circulation in 1967, I believe, showing that there was a relationship between the amplitude of the mitral annulus to stroke volume of the left ventricle. And to my knowledge, that's the first effort at looking at left ventricular function. It's intriguing at the annulus now, which is a routine part of what we did. We did it with Mmode, and people are now doing with the tissue Doppler or what have you. But that was done in 1967.
Were you beginning to get buy-in from your colleagues in cardiology, or they still thought you were crazy and out in the
my chief was still dead assent. In fact, it's not it's well known now. Rich Pop, I met Rich because his wife, sister married my wife's cousin, and so I met him at that particular wedding. And so I was telling him, and he was coming from Hopkins to Indiana for his residency and then going into fellowship. Right. And I would tell him what we were doing. And he was intrigued, and during his residency, he would visit with me now and then, and I would show him. By that time, we were already saw electrical alternans. We had seen this mitral annulus motion. We were looking more and more at the left ventricle. I had some thoughts that we might be able to look at wall thickness. And so when it comes to his fellowship, he wanted to work with me. The chief did not think that was a good idea, because he was still convinced that what we were doing, and part of the problem I had is that I came on the field right after ballistocardiography, which was supposed to be the greatest cardiological examination technique of all time. Isaac Starr from Philadelphia had really popularized it, and by the time I came up with ultrasound, they decided it was garbage. The other problem, unfortunately, was that some people had tried to duplicate what Edler had done. And ultrasound was a known entity, and by that time it was already discredited. So that also worked against me. And I had to say, no, we got a different approach, because people say, oh, yeah, I heard about ultrasound. Yeah, that's a garbage stuff. So I had great problems. Even my own chief of medicine, who was a personal, that's the reason I came back to Indiana, was because of him. He told my wife, he said, look, we'll let him do what he wants, but he's young, he'll get over it, but that's not going anywhere either.
He'll get over it.
It's not going anywhere either. But my wife Phyllis went ahead with letting me do this, because I had said to Smith Kline people, they had a meeting because they had to decide whether they're going to do anything with ultrasound, and I said ultrasound, and this was 1965. I said that was when the meeting was. I said cardiac ultrasound is going to be one of the major examinations of the heart, and I said it's not a pipe dream. It's real. We're seeing the actual heart. Parts of the heart, and we're getting more and more information of the heart. It's real. It's not an indirect thing. It's not something like the ballistic cardiogram. It's not even like an apex heart. It's the actually visual heart. It has to be useful.
Didn't somebody say, well, we've got fluoroscopy. We can do that.
Yeah, you don't see inside the heart with the fluoroscopy. Unless you do, you have to.
No, I understand. I understand.
In fact, that's kind of an interesting story here, too. I took my cardiology board in 1969. You had to be so many years out of your fellowship and stuff like that. All right, that was it was a oral examination. So you had certain stations. You go to the EKG station, you go to pathology station, whatever. So I was doing pretty well, and I thought I was getting along fine. And then I got to the radiology section, and they presided. Now, this is 1969, and I already published in 1965.
So you already had your paper.
I already had. They give me a PA chest film with a large cardiac silhouette. And he says, what do you do now? Well, I was feeling pretty good because I thought I was going to probably pass. And I said, well, do you want the answer you want, or do you want the right answer? Well, he didn't think that was funny at all. He didn't know anything about ultrasound. I certainly didn't have any reputation at that time. And do you know what he wanted? It was amazing.
What?
He wanted to take that patient, lay him on the left side, and put in a bolus of carbon dioxide gas, and see the difference between the border of the gas and the border of the silhouette.
On fluoroscopy.
On fluoroscopy, that's right.
Unbelievable.
All right. So that's how you saw the inside of the heart in those days, or obviously ventriculography. So anyway, it was obvious to me, and I don't know why, but I had a great deal of difficulty convincing anybody else that it was useful. There were very few people who really thought it was useful. I'll tell you another one. I can tell you a lot of negatives, but one that was it was a mixed bag was Charles Friedberg. Charles Friedberg was the author of one of the standard textbooks in cardiology.
Okay.
Now, I have he did something which most people would upset them, but not me. He took one of my diagrams of pericardial effusion from the literature and put it in his textbook, of course with no credit. All right. Now, you ought to be upset about it, but I wasn't, because I thought that he had enough to want to steal something from my study just to show that pericardial effusion with ultrasound was useful.
Sure.
That was a breakthrough, because nobody else did that. No one else thought it was useful at all. So yeah, it was a really tough. And one reason that I trained as many people as I did is because no one knew what the heck we were doing.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to, there are a bunch of things I want to get to, but I was going to ask, so Rich was there, and then you obviously had, you had all these guys. You had Jim Dillon, you had Ned Wayman, you were the motherlode of Echo.
Well, Zaki was actually the first. There was another, Rich wasn't the first, obviously. He was down the line a little bit. But yes, we had a lot of fellows, among obviously Wayman, Armstrong, Ryan, Dillon, a whole host of people who then went on to do fantastic things. But we also had an open house. Al came. Al Parisi came, Tony DeMaria came, Stan Goldberg from Arizona came, Dick Meyer from Cincinnati. We had an open house, and they would be coming all the time.
So, things. I mean, you had not had a meeting yet, okay?
No,
and there was obviously no journal of
well,
Echo at
the
that
first
point.
meeting was in January '68, so that was
okay. So you did
close.
have. Okay.
Yeah, we had a meeting in January 1968.
Tell me a little bit about that first meeting.
Okay. Well, first of all, I held it in Indianapolis.
Okay.
And in January.
Great.
And I opened the meeting by saying there is a big advantage of having a meeting in Indianapolis in January. I know why you're here. Because there's no other possible reason you'd want to be here in January. All right. At that meeting, I invited Inge Edler.
Okay.
I must tell you the truth. I was disappointed because, well, first of all, I didn't know the man.
Right.
That's the first time I met him. He didn't speak English very well at all, and he refused to give a lecture.
Really?
Yes. Well, I didn't know at the time that he wasn't working in ultrasound anymore. He wasn't doing anything. He had nothing new to show. What he did, he brought a movie that he published that was done in 1960, which was actually a very nice movie.
Right.
He showed a lot of things, and somehow it never clicked. I don't know.
Interesting.
He actually did show a large anterior pericardial effusion. He showed the aortic valve, but somehow he didn't put two and two together. And he only thought with that E to F slope. I don't know why he hung everything out on that E to F slope, and that's all he thought was useful. And then
who else did you have at the meeting?
Well, Rich was a fellow at the time,
okay.
So he was there. Bernie Siegel, not the one from Philadelphia, but the one from Seattle,
okay.
Was there for looking at venous. We had peripheral. It was totally cardiovascular, by the way. It was peripheral as well as cardiac. Claude Joyner was on the faculty. Eugene Strandis, he was on the faculty.
And how many people did you have? And
well, there were about 50 people who attended. And
50?
One of them, yeah, 50. Okay. Ray Gramiak was attended. He attended the course. I'm not sure if Barry Goldberg may have too, because Barry happens to be at this meeting. He might have been there. I don't remember too many others, but I still have some pictures.
The first,
about
so that's actually the first echo or ultrasound
yes,
meeting.
it was the first cardiac or cardiovascular meeting dedicated to that. Now, they'd been presented in other things.
Sure.
I saw Edler lecture in 1965 in Pittsburgh, but it was a general ultrasound meeting,
right.
And he just gave the cardiac. Again, he only meant, I'd already published on pericardial effusion, and he didnn't mention anything about pericardial effusion. And he only talked about the E to F slope.
Isn't that interesting?
And then I even visited Edler in 1969 in his lab, and he wasn't doing any ultrasound hardly at all.
Interesting. How'd you get the idea to start it?
Yeah.
Isn't there a famous swinger story or something?
Right. Okay. It must have been 1964. 74. Okay. 1974. At which time, ultrasound and cardiac ultrasound, especially pericardial effusion by that time, it was already now accepted, and there was reimbursement. We went quite a number of years before we could get any reimbursement, but now it's a reimbursable procedure.
Sure.
So I get a letter from the American College of Radiology, and I believe it was co-signed or signed by Harold Schwinger, the chairman of the board of the American College of Radiology. And the letter basically was establishing the fee schedule for all ultrasonic imaging.
Okay.
And he sent out a fee schedule for cardiac ultrasonic imaging, and he wanted my endorsement. That was the essence of the letter. Well, my reaction was totally negative. I said, what is this all about? First of all, the fee schedule was outrageous, to be honest with you. But besides that, where did radiology come off saying that they were nowhere outside of Gramiak, and I can think of one other. There was a fellow named Mark Lapioker out of Philadelphia who had done a little pericardial effusion. That was it. Everybody else by that time was all cardiology. Plus, we were getting more into hemodynamics. I mean, I was still looking at an Mmode from a hemodynamic point of view,
right.
Because of flow. And they showed no interest in that. And plus, Gramiak was working with Pravin Shah at the time.
Right.
And that's where he was getting his information. And then later it was Nanda. So I called Bill Nelligan, who was then the executive director of the American College of Cardiology. I said, Bill, the College of Radiology feels that they have jurisdiction here about the fee schedules for all ultrasound, including cardiac ultrasound. We can't tolerate that. That's nonsense. They don't have any claims to this. So Bill arranged for a meeting here in Washington, as a matter of fact, at one of the airport hotels to get together. So at that meeting, and I brought Arnie Weissler with me because I was not politically savvy. I was never active in any of the organizations.
Right, sure.
I was just not that. So I brought Arnie Weissler with me, who was then chief cardiology at Ohio State, to come with us. And then Harold Schwinger was there, who was the chairman of the board. He brought Mark Lapioker. And then there was one of the lobbyists for radiology who was there. We sat down, and Dr. Schwinger decides to kind of be the chairman of the meeting. And he said, Dr. Feigenbaum, I'm going to be straight up with you. I don't know anything about cardiac ultrasound. In fact, I don't happen to know anything about any ultrasonic imaging. But if we let you cardiologists do your own cardiac ultrasound, you're going to want to do your own cardiac angiography. You want to do your own cardiac nuclear. You're going to want to do your own cardiac fluoroscopy, and there's no way we're going to permit you to do that. Now, I just said, well, Dr. Schwinger, we have nothing to discuss. I said, how are you in sports? My plane leaves in about, and that was it. We never did discuss anything. And that's when I decided we had to be organized. This was nonsense.
So did you decide to start a society?
Yes, what I did. I was putting on an American College of Cardiology sponsored course in Indianapolis for years.
Okay.
All right. I had one coming up the following September.
Now, were these ultrasound cardiology courses?
Echocardiology.
Okay.
I put on many, many cardiology courses. We used to put workshops 3 times a year. First with Mmode, then 2D, then stress, whatever came up.
So you had an upcoming
and then we'd have an annual meeting, which is a large meeting, where we'd have several hundred people in attendance on an average. We had as many as 400 in 1 or 2 years. All right, this one's coming up. What I decided to do, I invited the speakers, and I selected them because I wanted them to be the new board of directors of this new organization. But they didn't know it at the time.
They didn't know, okay.
So I had people like Joyner. Okay. I had people like Gramiak.
Okay.
Of course, Rich Pop was there, and I think Tony. And it was at the faculty dinner meeting, at the dinner of that meeting, that I said, now we got to have an organization. And I thought that this group would make a good starting board of directors.
What kind of reaction did you get from them?
Shock at first, but general acceptance. Roberta Williams was there.
Okay.
I remember she was part of it as well. The only problem we had was with Gramiak. And I strongly recommend that I would be willing to serve as the first president, but I thought that we ought to have a radiologist as the vice president, because I didn't want this to be a total cardiac organization.
Interesting.
I wanted anybody who is willing to do a good job with cardiac ultrasound, irrespective of their training or their label, is more than welcome to be part of this organization. And Ray did agree to become vice president at that meeting.
Did you come up with the name? I mean, do you stand up at the dinner and say, I think we need an organization,
yes.
We're going to call it the American Society?
That's right. Yeah.
You came up with the
name.
name.
Right.
And what year are we talking about
1975.
now? 1975.
It was in the fall of 1975.
So that was the beginning of the American Society.
Yeah, that's when it started. And I had Jim Dillon as the secretary, and I didn't know anything about organizations, but he was the volunteer fireman at the Wayne Township County Fire Department, and he had set up the bylaws and stuff, and those are the framework of the American Society of Echocardiology.
Came out of the fire department.
All came out of the fire department. Yeah, that's right.
That's incredible. We could go all day, but we're gonna need to break out.
Right.
Let me ask you: as you now look, okay, so here we are, 1963 to 2009. What do you think about the field that you've started?
Oh, gosh, I'm the luckiest person in the world for having found that thing. I don't know who put that ad in the paper from BioSonar, but if I ever found them, I would just kiss them 10,000 times. I mean, it was the greatest thing that happened to my professional life.
Well, you know, you look at it, you made the prediction, which I think, you know, we were talking about predictions, not making stuff, but you made the prediction that it was going to be critical in cardiology. It probably is the most important diagnostic modality.
One of the advantages I had too, I was active in the general ultrasound community early on,
Sure.
American Institute of Ultrasound Medicine. At one early meeting, they had an after-dinner speaker who was an expert in bats.
Bats.
Bats, yes. And he gave a demonstration. There was a movie as well as a discussion as to how bats visualize their environment sonically,
Sure.
because they're totally blind.
Sure.
I was completely impressed. And so I have always philosophically felt, by God, if we could ever get as good as a bat, and then they have to be in 3 dimensions. I'm sure they're not flying around at huge speeds and finding insects flying and capturing the insects to survive.
Sure.
They must have a fantastic way. And so I always think of this as a physiologic technique.
Yeah.
And that, and then the second part is I'm always amazed how the engineers have been able to come up with something new every day. Right now, for example, I'm terribly intrigued with speckle tracking.
Right.
And which is almost unique to ultrasonic imaging.
Yeah.
So people ask me, how come you haven't retired? And how come you're not doing MR and CT and all that? I said, hey, we haven't exhausted ultrasonic imaging. We're still not as good as the bat. We now can even fool Mother Nature. I always felt we were limited by the speed of sound. We go out with all kinds of techniques to even fool that. And it's a constant. In fact, if I were to say any problem we have right now, we have almost too many things going on. People don't know, well, should I be talking about speckle tracking?
Right.
Or should I be talking about 3D?
Right.
Or maybe where am I supposed to go to? And every year they're making improvements. Well, when does this settle down? When should I actually make an investment and buy something? No, we haven't seen the end of ultrasound at all. And competition, I'm never concerned about competition. I'm not an imager. I've never been an imager. I don't believe that echocardiography is a, quote, imaging technique. It's an extension of the physical examination in many ways. And it's another sense. I always think about building ultrasound machines similar to the aircraft industry. See, ancient man saw birds that could fly, but nature didn't see fit to give us wings, so we had to build a machine with wings so we could fly like a bird. Well, we're doing the same thing. Nature didn't seem to give us sonic imaging as a sense like the aquatic mammals have, so we have to build machines to function like whales and dolphins. And so
the future looks bright.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It will be a fundamental aspect. Ultrasonic imaging will be a fundamental part of examining the human body for time immemorial.
Listen, I deeply appreciate you. You know this. We're all appreciative for your getting us started and for sharing your memories with us today. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.